Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to the channel. In today's update, we're going to walk through the most significant developments that unfolded over the past 12 hours. There's been a flood of political news, battlefield shifts, and strategic statements from all sides, so let's dive straight into it. As many of you already know, yesterday, Sunday, November 24th, 2025, a major closed-door meeting took place in Switzerland. Delegations from Ukraine, several European countries, and the United States all gathered in Geneva for what many outlets are calling one of the most important diplomatic engagements of the year. According to the information circulating, there were 2 full rounds of discussions. The first photo from inside the meeting room showed only the US and Ukrainian representatives seated together reviewing documents. Later, another image was published, this time showing the European delegation joining in, which suggests the talks had moved into the multilateral phase. Now, the big topic on the table was the 28-point peace plan proposed by US President Donald Trump. This plan has been mentioned in previous updates, and today's meeting confirmed that Ukraine and European partners were pushing to modify several parts of it. Sources say the conversations were extremely specific. These weren't broad, philosophical discussions about peace, but rather technical negotiations over 28 concrete points. During the last 12 hours, 2 major documents surfaced. The first was released by the European Union itself. It's their 2024 counter-proposal, a 24-point plan that's intended as Europe's version of how a peace settlement should look. I've read through it, and honestly, the document feels symbolic more than anything. In practical terms, it's unlikely either Washington or Moscow will give that proposal serious consideration. It doesn't align with the strategic realities on the ground, and both superpowers have made it clear they're not adjusting their red lines for Europe's sake. The second document, however, is much more important. This one outlines the adjustments Ukraine and European states are demanding to Trump's original 28-point plan. According to Bloomberg and other Western outlets, these are the 4 major amendments they're pushing during the Geneva talks. No immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Donetsk. Kyiv and EU governments are trying to freeze the current front line before discussing any territorial settlements. Negotiations on territorial exchanges only after a ceasefire is fully in place. Security guarantees from the United States at the level of NATO Article 5. That basically means they want Washington to treat Ukraine as if it were a full NATO member. Use of frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. These funds would stay locked unless Russia pays reparations. The US would also expect compensation for providing security guarantees. Additionally, they want the Ukrainian armed forces to maintain a minimum strength of 800,000 personnel, an increase from the 600,000 stated in Trump's original draft. Now, here's where things get interesting. Despite public optimism from all sides, Ukrainians saying they managed to secure important changes, Europeans saying negotiations are constructive, and American lawmakers giving polished statements, the tone behind closed doors appears very different. Why? Because several days before these Geneva talks, the US issued what many analysts describe as an ultimatum to President Zelensky. The message was straightforward. Either accept the 28-point plan or be prepared for severe consequences, including the rapid deterioration of Ukraine's military position. That ultimatum has been lingering over these negotiations all week, and it explains why we're seeing this huge media push, presenting the Geneva talks as a success for all sides. In reality, what we're seeing right now looks more like a coordinated attempt to create a media victory rather than a genuine diplomatic breakthrough. The timing, the statements, the messaging, it's all very carefully crafted. And while that makes sense politically, it doesn't mean the underlying issues are any closer to being resolved. What's even more telling is that it's highly uncertain whether the US will present this modified plan to Russia at all. Diplomats familiar with the process are skeptical. They suggest Washington is well aware Moscow will immediately reject any proposal that includes European or Ukrainian adjustments. The Kremlin has been consistent in its position. Territorial questions are non-negotiable under pressure. Meanwhile, Western sources have already reported that on November 27th, American generals will arrive in Ukraine for high-level meetings. And according to insiders, they're not coming to discuss the European 24-point plan, or even Kyiv's proposed amendments. They're coming to ask one question: will Zelensky accept the original plan or not? Multiple analysts are also reporting that if Ukraine refuses, the US may halt weapons deliveries, intelligence support, and possibly even pressure NATO states to limit their own transfers. American sources are already predicting that Ukraine could lose the entire Donbass region within 12 months. If American military support stops, that timeline could be even shorter. President Trump made only one public comment about the situation in the past 24 hours. He said Ukraine's leadership has shown zero gratitude for U.S. efforts, and he criticized Europe for continuing to purchase Russian oil. That statement alone reflects a significant degree of frustration, and when the president himself is unhappy, it's usually a clearer indicator of the real situation than a polite diplomatic press releases. So with that political context in mind, let's shift to the battlefield. The most dynamic changes during the past 12 hours happened in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Neutral mapping sources updated their maps overnight, and the new imagery shows that Russian forces have significantly improved their positions around the settlement of Stepnohirsk. At this point, the Ukrainian stronghold there, often referred to as the citadel of Stepnohirsk, is under what can only be described as a near-complete encirclement. If the situation continues at this pace, Ukrainian units may have to withdraw from the area within days. Once the Russians secure Stepnohirsk, they'll likely pause to regroup and then prepare to push eastward toward the city of Orikhiv. Meanwhile, pro-Ukrainian sources from the 65th Mechanized Brigade released a video supposedly showing a Russian attack being repelled. But earlier today, more reliable footage surfaced, showing Russian forces advancing into the settlement of Novodanilivka. That confirms what several neutral analysts had already marked on their maps. The Russians have penetrated Ukrainian defensive lines in that area. The Ministry of Defense of Russia also confirmed earlier that their forces now control Malotomachka. The exact status of Novodanilivka remains unclear, whether it's fully occupied or still contested. But what is obvious is that the Russian advance is pushing steadily toward Orikhiv from multiple directions, south, southeast, and likely soon from the west as Stepnohirsk falls. Now let's move over to the Hulayai direction. Over the last 12 hours, we've seen a few important updates from this sector. According to multiple independent mappers, Russian forces have continued consolidating their positions between the settlements of Vidne and Ternivate. Just yesterday, Russian troops raised their flag across several points in Ternivate, confirming control of the area. And today, analysts updated the situation around the Vovcha River. The imagery now shows that Russian units have secured the entire eastern bank of the river near Ternivate, solidifying their hold on the region. In addition to that, Russian forces have started bombing the M85 road, the main supply route linking Hulyapol and Vesele. Several videos show artillery strikes and drone attacks targeting Ukrainian logistics along this highway. If the Russians continue to push from Ternivate while simultaneously cutting the M85, we may see Ukrainian forces withdraw to avoid encirclement. At the moment, the road remains technically open, but the pattern of strikes suggests Russia wants to make it unusable in the coming days. Now let's turn to the Pokrovsk direction, one of the most fiercely contested front lines and arguably the bloodiest sector of the war at this moment. Yesterday, some pro-Ukrainian channels claimed their forces launched a counterattack and managed to retake almost the entire northern part of the city. However, these claims came without any visual proof. No geolocated video, no drone footage, nothing verifiable. On the other side, Russian channels did publish new footage from the southern part of Pokrovsk. One clip shows a Russian soldier raising a flag on top of the central hospital building. This doesn't confirm anything about the northern districts, but it does tell us that Russian units are steadily pushing deeper into the urban area. Because of the lack of evidence from the northern side, analysts haven't adjusted their maps. The territory north of the railway line still appears as a gray zone, meaning it's contested. It's very possible that both sides currently hold different pockets there, and that heavy fighting is ongoing. A particularly revealing video came from the Tzero 515 road near the town of Mirnohrad. In it, the entire road leading toward Ukrainian positions is lined with the burnt remains of armored vehicles, infantry carriers, and even civilian trucks used for logistics. This stretch looks more like a scrapyard than a functional supply route. The level of destruction shows just how costly Ukrainian counterattacks have been. Even if the counteroffensive near Pokrovsk is real, and not just a political move to strengthen Ukraine's position in Geneva, they're paying an enormous price for every kilometer. Next, we move to the settlement of Rodinsky. Yesterday, a number of sources posted footage showing Russian troops entering the town, but today we received a new geolocated video from Ukrainian operators. The footage shows an FPV drone flying over the central street, Lenina Street, where it targets a Russian soldier. This confirms two things. One, Russian troops have advanced into the central parts of Rodinsky. Two, Ukrainians still have active units operating inside the town. Based on this, analysts updated the map to show deeper Russian penetration. If the trend continues, Ukrainian defenders will likely have to retreat from the settlement entirely. The town has strategic value as one of the defensive layers protecting access to Pokrovsk. Just northeast of Rodinsky is the settlement of Sherbinivka, referred to in some reports as Shakova. According to overnight updates, this town has now fallen completely under Russian control. Yesterday, Russia secured the southern half. By this morning, they had taken the entire settlement. Ukrainian forces withdrew toward the line running through Centralny and Selidov, where they hope to stabilize the front. Let's move north toward the Siversk direction, one of the most active axes in Donetsk region over the past week. Yesterday, multiple sources, including the Russian Ministry of Defense, reported that the settlement of Pivnikhina, often spelled Pivna, had been captured. Today, there were further updates. Russian troops are now advancing along the Vasyukivka River, pushing into the settlement of Vasyukivka from the east. This is a critical development because Vasyukivka acts as a defensive anchor protecting the eastern approaches to Siversk. As Russian forces move between Pivna, Vasyukivka, and Zhelizna, analysts are increasingly confident that this is the early stage of a major offensive towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. The positioning suggests a classic envelopment attempt, cutting supply routes before pushing toward the cities themselves. Another significant development. Russian forces reportedly cut the TO-5-3 road between Zakitny and Lyman. This road was one of Ukraine's key lateral supply lines for the northern Donetsk front. According to today's mapping updates, the entire stretch is now under Russian control. If accurate, this severely restricts Ukrainian logistics and creates pressure on Ukrainian units defending the western outskirts of Lyman. Russian units are also pushing toward Lyman from the northwest and northern directions. That means we may see the early stages of the Battle of Lyman begin as soon as December 2025. Many analysts predict that if Ukrainian forces cannot stabilize the front within the next few weeks, they might face another forced withdrawal, similar to their retreat from Lysychansk last year. Before we wrap up for this section, let's zoom out again and revisit the political context because it directly ties into these battlefield movements. All the military developments we just covered, encirclements forming near Stepnohursk, collapses around Rodinsky, advances toward Lyman. They're happening at the same time that Ukraine is under immense pressure from the United States to make a decision on Trump's peace plan. The battlefield situation isn't separate from diplomacy. It is shaping the negotiations in Geneva. If the United States does decide to limit or halt military support, Ukrainian commanders will face near impossible conditions on multiple fronts. And the fact that American officials are speaking openly, repeatedly, about Ukraine's potential loss of Donbass in the next 12 months tells us that Washington is trying to signal urgency. Whether this is meant to pressure Kyiv, Moscow, or both remains unclear, but the implications are serious. President Zelensky is expected to travel to the United States within the next 3 days to meet President Trump directly. Many consider this the decisive moment. If Zelensky agrees to the original 28-point plan, we may see a shift into a negotiated phase of the conflict. If not, the consequences could be immediate and dramatic, affecting both the battlefield and Ukraine's long-term sustainability. To summarize this portion, Geneva talks appear more like political theater than genuine progress. U.S. pressure on Ukraine is intensifying. Russian forces continue advancing on multiple fronts. Key supply roads have been cut or are under heavy attack. Several Ukrainian defensive lines are on the verge of collapse. The next 3 days may determine the direction of the entire conflict. All right, let's continue by shifting attention back to the strategic picture because everything unfolding over the last 24 to 48 hours makes a lot more sense when you look at how battlefield events and diplomatic pressure are feeding into each other. From the political side, the message from Washington has been remarkably consistent and quite blunt. Ukraine must decide whether it will accept the original 28-point peace plan proposed by President Trump. And while various European leaders keep insisting publicly that the talks in Geneva were productive and constructive, the reality appears to be less optimistic. What we're seeing is a coordinated effort by Kyiv and its European partners to frame small tweaks to the plan as major diplomatic breakthroughs, even though the United States has not signaled the same enthusiasm. In fact, the more statements we hear from Trump himself, the clearer it becomes that he is frustrated with both Kyiv and Europe. His comment that Ukraine has shown zero gratitude and that Europe is still buying Russian oil indicates he believes the burden of the conflict is falling unfairly on the US. And when you combine that with the ultimatum given to Zelensky, accept the plan or risk losing all military and intelligence support, the stakes become obvious. Even if Ukraine and Europe submit counter-proposals, it doesn't necessarily mean Washington will even bring those documents to Moscow. The US might simply insist on the original plan and press Kiev to accept it as is. This political uncertainty is exactly why the developments on the battlefield matter so much right now. Russia clearly understands the diplomatic pressure Ukraine is facing and is accelerating offensives at multiple points to maximize leverage. Let's break down the most important frontline areas again because the pattern becomes striking when viewed together. We'll start with Zaporizhzhia, where Russia appears close to fully encircling Stepnohirsk. The town's citadel, as many analysts call its fortified industrial zone, is now nearly surrounded. Ukrainian troops there are likely preparing for a withdrawal before the pocket collapses completely. This is a familiar pattern. Russia applies pressure from multiple axes, cuts supply lines, and forces Ukraine to retreat to avoid encirclement. If Stepnohirsk falls, the next logical target is Orikhiv, a strategically important logistics hub that has been under near constant bombardment for months. Then we move to the Hulyapol sector, where Russia is slowly but steadily grinding forward. The newly confirmed control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha River gives Russian forces a much more stable bridgehead from which to push north and west. The increasing bombardment of the M85 supply road is another troubling sign. Even if Ukraine holds its defensive positions for now, the inability to move reinforcements or supplies without heavy losses could force a withdrawal in the near future. This tactic, making the front line unsustainable rather than trying to break through with sheer force, has worked for Russia in multiple areas over the past year. Pokrovsk remains one of the most dangerous hotspots. Without visual evidence, it's difficult to confirm Ukraine's claims about retaking northern districts. What we can confirm is that Russia is deeply entrenched in the southern part of the city, and appears to be applying pressure along the railway line that cuts through Pokrovsk horizontally. Control of this railway is crucial. If Russia pushes north of it, Ukrainian units could find themselves split into isolated pockets with limited mobility. And again, the footage from the T-0515 road near Myrnarad tells a broader story of attrition. It's not just a few destroyed vehicles, it's dozens, maybe more. When a resupply route becomes a graveyard of burnt-out armor, commanders don't need a map to understand the situation. They know they're losing too much equipment to maintain the tempo of counterattacks. Even if Ukraine is launching local assaults for symbolic or diplomatic reasons, the cost is becoming unsustainable. Next, Rodinsky, another example of Russia pushing forward street by street. The FPV drone footage showing Ukrainian forces engaging Russian troops directly inside the town's center makes it clear that the front line is fluid, but generally moving westward in Russia's favor. If Rodinsky falls entirely, Ukrainian forces will likely reposition towards Selidove and Novorodivka to form the next defensive line. Shcherbynivka, or Shakova, depending on the map source, also fell within the last 24 hours. This marks yet another tactical loss in a chain of defensive layers that Ukraine has been relying on to slow Russia's westward advance toward Pokrovsk. With each settlement that falls, Russia gets closer to threatening the deeper defensive belt, protecting the industrial cluster around Pokrovsk and Ukrainsk. Now the Siversk direction. This area has seen a surge in activity. The fall of Pivna set the stage for Russia to push along the river system toward Vasyukivka. Control of river crossings is critical here because they serve as natural choke points. Today's reports show Russian troops advancing along the Vasyukivka River and into the settlement itself. If Vasyukivka is captured, it opens the path toward the southern approaches of Siversk. Add to this the confirmed cuts along the Tidov-13 road between Zakatne and Lyman. That road is more than just a logistical route. It's one of the last viable east-west arteries that Ukrainian forces depend on for reinforcement and withdrawal. Losing it puts enormous pressure on the units defending Lyman. And as Russian forces advance from the northwest and north at the same time, the outline of a larger encirclement attempt becomes increasingly clear. If the Russian pace continues, many analysts believe that the battle for Lyman could begin within weeks. December 2025 might become a defining period for the entire northern Donetsk front. Losing Lyman would not only be a symbolic blow, it would open the pathway towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, two of the most strategically important cities remaining under Ukrainian control in Donbass. So when you connect all these dots, a picture emerges. Russia is applying maximum pressure across the entire front at the exact moment Ukraine is negotiating from a position of weakness. Not only that, but US statements about Ukraine potentially losing Donbass within the next year, statements coming from pro-American sources, suggest Washington is preparing the public for potential territorial concessions. And if the US actually follows through on its threat to halt military aid, the timeline could accelerate dramatically. President Zelensky's upcoming trip to the United States now becomes the central event. Whatever decision emerges from that meeting could immediately reshape both the military and political landscape. If he agrees to Trump's plan, the war could shift toward a negotiated freeze. If he refuses, Ukraine could face the most severe military pressure of the entire conflict. So as we end today's breakdown, here's the situation in simple terms. The Geneva meetings produced more political theater than meaningful progress. Russia is advancing steadily on nearly every active front. Ukraine is suffering heavy equipment losses in several key areas. US pressure on Kyiv is at an all-time high. The next 3 days are poised to be decisive for both the war and the diplomatic track. And that's where we leave it for now. As always, we condemn all violence and hope for a future where these updates are no longer necessary. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and join the channel's Patreon if you want to support our work. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.